now 5:32. Let me introduce our speakers today. So Alice Mesnard and Tiffanie Perrault with a joint paper with Emmanuelle Auriol. So I would say that the deep source of inspiration of this paper is the work by Gary Becker. So the use of markets and prices to deal with a major economic problem that is related to human smuggling. So Alice has already made contributions in the migration literature around this topic and more than this. So we're really happy to have you online with us today. And Alice, the floor is yours. You have around 45 minutes.
Well, thank you very much, Simone, and thank you all for attending this seminar in this especially hot, sunny day after the terraces are open. So thanks for being with us, and hopefully we'll keep you. So this is joint work with Emmanuelle and Tiffanie Perrault. Tiffanie is a PhD candidate of the University of Montreal and a fantastic author. So I'm happy to introduce her to you as well today. So the motivations of the paper is that, as we all know, there is a booming market for human smuggling, and this brings billions of revenue into the hands of criminal networks. And in most OECD countries, the public opinion is strongly against illegal migration, so as reported in polls, and is much more divided about legal migration. And perhaps one of the reasons is that not all labor market needs are and can be satisfied by resident workers. And this has been very salient, especially in the last year during COVID. Remember that in October 2020, the French government has imported 900 workers from Morocco as an emergency into Corsica to rescue the clementine crop. And these similar things happened in the UK and in other countries. So another maybe deep motivation is that many people question let's say, efficacy of migration policy, if not the ethical grounds as well of migration policies, in particular facing this large arrival of irregular border crossings. And we may be far away from the Sustainable Development Goal for 2030 target, which calls on countries to facilitate orderly, safe, regular, and responsible migration. So the question we have here is whether we can put an end or at least weaken the human smuggling market, and at the same time, whether we can regulate the economic migration flows. So there is a now growing literature on these missing migration markets. And this is starting from the recognition that the very large wage differentials or economic gains for poor workers in low-income countries to gain high-income countries, combined with the very high restrictions to migration, do create huge incentives for crossing borders irregularly. And so, as Simone mentioned, so there have been lots of some proposals, and in particular the prominent proposal by Gary Becker, which proposes to put visa in auctions in order to regulate the legal migration flows. So this proposal has many advantages, and in fact, it brings some revenue into host countries, which can be agreeable for the residents, but it also is a way as well to attract the workers who are likely to be the most able to contribute to the host economy and hence are willing to pay for these high bids. So this is an advantage, but on the other hand, one issue with that is that this is also likely to leave some room for smugglers to operate because of the type of these visas that are sold at a very high price and their limited number. It is likely that this kind of visa will not meet the migration demand by poor workers who may prefer to use the cheaper services by smugglers and hence still cross borders illegally. So this is one problem that we address in our companion paper, so previous work with Emmanuelle Auriol, So what we designed in that work is a set of permanent visa who are going to be sold at what we call an eviction price, which is set such that the smugglers are driven out of business. And what we show in this paper is that by doing so, we can show that there will be a policy trade-off. So either you legalize migration through these schemes, and in which case the migration flows increase substantially, or you use the help of the smugglers to regulate the market, and it will limit the number of people coming into the economy. So the second problem with this proposal is that the type of visa that we designed, so which are permanent visa, will be good to attract high-skilled migrants into the host economy. And in fact, the equilibrium price can be set quite high, so this eviction price, which will be, again, maybe good to attract migrants, workers who are not too poor, and that will also attract the high-skilled migrants. So still, again, there is a lack of channel for low-skilled migrants, and this has been one of the criticisms that the OECD Migration Division had towards our proposal when we presented that to them. So what we do today is to propose a different scheme for temporary visa. So the temporary visa will be sold at price PL, and they have the duration tau. So it will be a visa that has two characteristics, the duration and the price, and the two will be linked. And these are designed in order to throttle the smugglers' activities. And we will see that those visas that we propose will be for specific jobs which are low paid in specific sectors of the economy, which are typically not all met by the resident workers. So for example, building sector or restoration or domestic care. And so those visas will attract that are of limited duration. They will attract low-skilled workers at low price. So an interesting feature of this new visa scheme is that it relies on existing legal framework. And this is in contrast to previous proposals. So for example, Cyprus, Israel, Canada rely heavily on systems of temporary foreign worker permits, for example, for seasonal workers in agriculture, or the Gulf countries, so Saudi Arabia, so we had a presentation last week about that, or Southeast Asia, so Hong Kong, for example, Singapore, and lots of countries there, they massively recruit low-skilled workers to contribute to their economy. So they have been often criticized by, in particular, practitioners in law and scholars in law and sociologists. And they also have, because those often abuse the rights of the workers, and they have been analyzed by economists for their efficacy. So in particular, Djajic and Vinogradova have studied the workability of such guest worker programs. So what we do in our paper is to use this kind of visa schemes, so temporary visa schemes, but we will in fact study how the smugglers respond to the introduction of such schemes. And we will use our framework to propose a set of visa set at eviction prices such that the smugglers can no longer do businesses unless they make negative profits. So they will be evicted from the market. And what we also do in this paper is that we model the decisions of migrants who in reality are facing extremely high risk of failure. And in fact, there is some empirical evidence now that is so experiments done, for example, in the Gambia to Europe. So we know that those migrants take huge risks to cross the borders, and evidence as well from Arkonbai on Senegal. So all this points to very high risk of failing the illegal migration, in which case either you go back to your home country or you are stuck and you are in terrible places, or you die en route. And so to make sense of these decisions, what we will use is a framework that is borrowed from the behavioral economics, where we allow workers to have distorted risk perceptions and distorted behavior. We'll see that it is not essential as well. Everything is robust without that, but that is interesting. And the findings that we have show that the risk to fail migration and the risk to be deported are in fact key elements if a government wants to design workable systems of visa against smugglers. So let me now briefly explain the talk outlines. I will first briefly sketch the smuggling market, where there is a supply of services from smugglers, and the demand comes from workers who, in status quo, have no other means to cross the border. So they are obliged to go illegally through the smuggler services. And then we will look at the equilibrium on this illegal market. And then we will introduce the temporary visa scheme. We will talk about the constraints that the government faces, in particular, if a government wants to avoid those workers to overstay. And we will show how a government can set the visa price to drive the smugglers out of business. Then we'll look at the results, and in particular, we will see how we can use those visa schemes to adjust the flow of migrants that may be wished by given the objectives of a government. So they are used to regulate migration flows. And we will then briefly talk about how to combine those visas with other instruments that can be combined optimally for setting cost-effective policies. So if you want to minimize the budget of a government. And then Tiffanie will go through the numerical applications to illustrate all the policy implications. Any question?
I have a question, Alice.
Yes.
Are you going to present a two-country model with one origin and one destination?
Yes.
Okay, and then I will get back to you whether you think that extensions to what would be the implication of extensions to multiple destinations in this
setting. Do you want to discuss that at the end?
Yeah, fine. Yeah.
It will be clearer, I hope.
Yeah.
So the smuggling market. So on the supply side, what we very generally feature is a market where you have n smugglers. So the market can be more or less competitive. Okay, and what we very simply assume is that the smugglers compete à la Cournot, so they maximize their profits, and this will lead to this equilibrium price of the smuggling services, so the fees PI, which will be an increasing function of their marginal cost to operate, which is extremely standard, and a decreasing function of the number of smugglers on the market, and will be as well a decreasing function of the price elasticity of demand for smuggler services. So DI is a demand for illegal services at price PI, the smuggling price. And we can now turn to the demand side of the market. So what we assume is that in the home country, you have a distribution of workers who have heterogeneous skill levels, theta, following this distribution, F, very standardly behaved. So these workers, they can behave rationally. So it's simply, you can use the standard expected utility theory, or better, as we believe it is perhaps more appropriate, we can use as well the cumulative prospect theory to feature some behavioral traits. And in particular, so we use the Tversky and Kahneman papers, and in particular, we will feature the fact that the workers have loss aversion. They may have diminishing sensitivity for gains and losses, and they also have diminishing sensitivity regarding probabilities. So they may, in fact, overestimate some very infrequent but salient feature, for example, the success of their migration, and they might underestimate the probability to fail their migration. Okay, so this is possible. It is not essential for all the results that also hold under the standard expected utility theory. So a migrant who contemplates the decision to migrate will compare this uncertain lottery in case he or she migrates. So with the probability Q, so the risk, the probability Q of failing migration, the migrants will return to the home country where he will earn the home country wage, WH, plus some return to his skill, which is here embedded in this function of returns to skill, delta H. So, and he will lose as well the price that he paid to the smugglers, which is a sunk cost. Now, with the probability 1 minus Q, he will succeed to reach the destination country, in which case he will earn the high wage country, WF, the minimum wage, discounted by this D factor, which is smaller than 1, which is because he works in the illegal sector as opposed to the legal sector. And of course, he will also have paid for the smuggling fees, PI. So the comparison of this lottery will be with the certain payoff in case the migrant stays at home. And then in this case, the earnings of the migrant will be this increasing function of the minimum wage at home and also increasing in the returns to skill. So comparing these two lottery, we can determine the marginal migrant with a skill level theta I, which is such that this migrant is indifferent between migrating legally or illegally. So we will show that any migrant below this threshold theta I, which is here the implicit function of the equation 1 written below, will prefer to migrate illegally, and above, they will prefer to stay home. So this negative selection of workers is simply driven by the fact that you have no returns to skill in the foreign country. Okay, so this is people who have high returns to skill, they may prefer to stay in their home country. And the migration demand then can be written okay, by integrating from the lowest skill individual 0 to the threshold theta I. So what we can show, which is very intuitive, is that this threshold will decrease, for example, as the price of illegal migration increases, or as the risk of migrating illegally Q increases, or as okay, it will, on the other hand, increase as the wage differential between the earnings abroad and earning at home increases. Okay, all that is very standard and natural. Okay, so now we can, so maybe I stop here if you have a question on the framework.
Can I ask a question? So Q is an exogenous parameter. It doesn't depend on how many people are trying to cross the border.
No, it does not. Okay, we will see that now when we design the policy, we will in fact endogenize this parameter just by how much means the government puts to control the borders. Okay, but we don't. Okay, we don't do the equilibrium of the number of migrants.
Okay, thanks.
So, any other question? For the moment, all the parameters are exogenous, but then we will use them as instruments. Okay. So now we introduce temporary visa schemes, and what we do is, okay, we think of a scheme. So in the situation where a government can commit to the policy, so credibly to do the policy. So once the policy is announced, the smugglers will react to the policy. And so the policy is to sell temporary visa at price PL for duration tau for low-paid jobs. And then the smugglers react to the policy, and what they will do is they will try to attract some migrants by lowering their price, and hence you will push up the theta I threshold, okay, to try to keep some of the demand. And hence the government will propose a scheme of temporary visa, okay, at not too high price in order to price out the smugglers. And we resolve that by backward induction. So I'll show you how we do. So first of all, if a government wants to sell visa on this new legal market, there are 3 constraints that need to be satisfied. So the first one is the individual rationality constraint. So you need to incentivize some people to migrate legally rather than stay home. So the price of visa cannot be put too high, for example. So to determine this constraint, so this is written here, simply you compare the certain payoff of a migrant if he migrates legally for a duration tau and spends 1 minus tau the rest of his life in the home country, okay, with the payoff if he stays in the home country. And this will straightforwardly determine this threshold, theta L, which is that below this skill level, workers prefer to migrate legally. And above this threshold, they prefer to stay home. And again, the very simple intuition is that this scheme does propose visa for low skill, for like type of jobs that do not have returns to skill. And we could extend that by putting low returns to skill, lower than in the home country. And we could work on that, but to simplify, I put 0 returns to skill here, which is driving the fact that the legal migration is selecting migrants negatively through these schemes for low-paid jobs. All right, and now what we are going to study is a second constraint for government, which is to incentivize some workers to take up some low-skill jobs rather than migrating illegally and stay in the foreign country as long as they can. So this is an incentive compatibility constraint. And again, we can work on the decision, which is to compare the uncertain lottery of migrating illegally with the certain payoff of migrating legally with a skill. And now this will determine this threshold skill level, so theta Li, which is such that below this threshold, the workers will migrate illegally, and above the threshold, they will migrate legally. So again, this negative selection of the illegal migrants after the government proposes the scheme is driven by the fact that if you migrate illegally, you have no returns to skill forever, often for a very long time, as opposed to if you migrate legally, where you return to your home country at some point. So we will also, we can show static comparative that this threshold theta Li does heavily depend on all the other parameters of the model. So you can push down this threshold very intuitively if you increase the price of illegal migration, because this option becomes less attractive, or if you increase the risk of migrating illegally, Q. You push down as well if you increase the duration of visa, because now the legal option is more attractive, or if you decrease the price of legal visa. Okay, and as well, you can play with a wage differential. So all that is quite intuitive. And now I turn to the third constraint of a government. So now the government as well would need to make sure that these workers coming through this scheme do not stay forever in the destination country, do not overstay. So the government wants to incentivize workers to return home after the visa expires. And here, I'm not going to show you because of time limitation, constraints in detail. However, you understand very intuitively that if you combine retention share of the income earned abroad that is locked on a bank account until the worker comes back and then can be given back to the worker if he complies with the visa rule, you combine this with a risk of deportation in case you are caught to work illegally if you have overstayed. You can, in fact, show that it is always possible to design a set of visas that are self-enforceable. So if you can increase this deportation rate close to 1, okay, you will always be able to do a set of self-enforceable visa, to design this set. So you can also show that the minimum deportation threshold such that the visa scheme is enforceable will also heavily depend on all the other instruments that the government may use. And in particular, it will decrease with the share of retention of income, or it will decrease with the visa duration, which is also very intuitive. If you increase the amount of money that you lock on the bank account, it will be easier to self-enforce the visa, even with a lower deportation probability. Okay, so all that is nice. And you can show that the compliance is also more likely, and this is very important for our discussions, as the income ratio between the destination country and the home country decreases. This is because then there are fewer incentives to overstay. Okay, so it will be easier to self-enforce this visa with reasonable rate of deportation or reasonable rate of retention. And as well, you can show that the high-skilled workers are more easy to incentivize. Why? Because they have the return to scheme in their home country. So that will be as well quite important for the design of our visa scheme. So now I turn to the scheme that seeks to price out the smugglers. So, yes, sorry, Frédéric.
Alice, can I ask a question?
Yes.
About this deportation, just a clarification question. First, when you introduced your model without this temporary visa scheme at the beginning, you had this possibility to migrate Q and 1 minus Q not to migrate. In case you succeed, there was no deportation at that stage?
So because I think, okay, you could add then once, when you succeed, there is no deportation, unless you overstay, yes.
And then now you introduce this deportation, but when does it happen? Suppose that you have to leave after period 2, the deportation is really after 2, or you could overstay for a certain period and then be detected, yeah. I don't know, at period 2 times 2 and then have to leave.
Yeah, so in fact, if you overstay, you can be detected. But so what we do is that we reserve the set of visa that is self-enforceable, not assuming that it is self-enforceable, so that the kind of the instruments for how you self-enforce that do not really matter, but then we work on the self-enforceability constraint. Okay, so if you overstay, then you will face the self-enforceability constraint. But to determine the price of visa to have a set of self-enforceable, you don't really need to work on the whole what happens if you don't enforce. See, just we assume that we propose set of visa that are self-enforceable, and then we check that they are self-enforceable and under which condition you have you need to satisfy for that. So I hope it will be clearer. And sorry, because I like to continue. You can question more if you want. So the temporary visa scheme. So what we now look at is how the smugglers respond by setting their price after the scheme is implemented. So now the smugglers will face a demand that is going from the zero skill, the lower skill workers, from this theta Li skill threshold, okay, so from the low distribution of skills, and the smugglers will compete still à la chrono by maximizing their profit, taking into account this new demand, which is a residual demand. And again, they will establish so that will result in the price in equilibrium, PI, which will be the response price by smugglers, okay, which will be, again, an increasing function of the marginal cost for smugglers to operate, decreasing in their number of the competing on the market, and decreasing in the price elasticity of demand. And so what we want to now design is the scheme of visa at the eviction price, okay, which is such that after the smugglers respond to the scheme and are going to push down their price to compete with the offer of legal visa, at some point they will no longer be able to make any positive profit. So after they price their service to their marginal cost, which is the lowest possible price so that they continue their business with profits, we will determine the eviction price PL, so PL lower bar, which will be the solution to that equation, theta Li equals 0. So in fact, you push down that threshold type of migrant to 0, so that you no longer have any demand for this visa after the smugglers try to compete with the offer. So just to clarify, so perhaps we understand straightforwardly that one way to push down this threshold here is, for example, by lowering the price of the visa, which we saw already in the previous with incentive compatibility constraint slide, that it will also push down this threshold to here. But you can also work with the other policy instruments that we will describe. So now we are going to adjust the scheme of visa in order to maybe to reach some objectives that are predetermined by a government. And perhaps one important consideration for a government would be to have some eviction price that are high enough, for example, to make revenue for the economy. Okay, so we can see that resolving the framework, we can set this eviction price, P lower bar, which depends on the duration of the visa, okay, such that you may want to have positive resources for the economy. So by resolving the model, so in fact, when you set, the visa price this manner, which I described, what you will get is this implicit function that gives you the visa price PL as a function of the migration duration, tau, and as a function of all the other parameters that are here. See, so the marginal cost for smuggler to operate and the discounting factor and the probability to fail migration. So you can now show that the eviction price will increase with the, for example, the risk to fail migration, or it will increase with the marginal cost for smuggler to operate, or increase with the migration duration of the duration of the visa. So this is very intuitive because as all these parameters are increased, it will be easier to fight the smugglers and drive them out of business with higher priced visa. Okay, and we understand as well that for the same reason, it decreases as the discounting value of working in the illegal sector increases, because in this case, it will be more difficult to fight against the smugglers, since the illegal migration gives higher gains to the migrants, and hence you will need to put the eviction price to a lower level. So all this shows that the visa price setting is complementary with all the other instruments that the government may want to use, and in particular enforcing the external control. So, for example, increasing C, the marginal cost for smuggler to operate, or, for example, increasing the restrictions at the border and increasing the failure of migration will be a way to set some visa at a higher price, and yet you can fight against the smugglers through this scheme. So now I'm a bit rushed in my time. So what I want to say here is that we can show as well that if those parameters are not very high, in particular if the visa duration is quite low, then in fact you may need to sponsor the migrants so that they come through this scheme. So you have a set of visa prices that are negative and that are very important. In fact, in reality, in history, at some point in the 60s, some governments were sponsoring the migration of temporary workers. Okay, perhaps for this reason. So now we can work on that, and we can also show again that all these policy instruments are complementary if you want to set the visa price at some levels. The second result is that now you can, perhaps a more interesting goal for a government is to try to maintain the same skill diversity of foreign workers coming through the scheme as compared to what was happening ex ante under the status quo. So again, what you can work is through this framework, you can now set the duration of the visa at a low enough level, so which here we call theta tilde, which is such that below this threshold, the visa price and the corresponding eviction price for this duration of visa will increase the skill diversity of the migrants coming through this scheme. So basically, you can use this scheme to adjust according to your economic needs in terms of the pool of migrants coming in through the scheme. And again, you can show very easily that this threshold is also decreasing with the other policy instruments. So again, you have this nice property that you have complementary policy instruments if you want to adjust your visa scheme to your policy goals. So what else do I want to say here? Because is that, okay, However, there might be a trade-off. If you put down your visa duration too low, then, and maybe this is one way to answer your question, Frédéric, then you might now, you might kick your self-enforceability constraints because the visa duration will be too low. So you need to check, of course, that your visa are self-enforceable. So you have some trade-off, and we'll work on that with the numerical applications. So the last result that we have is that now you have 4 policy instruments at hand. So you may want to combine them optimally. So finding the optimal level of internal border enforcement, external border enforcement, such that, and optimal, okay, so duration of visa, such that you will minimize the cost of the policy and reach your target. So your target in terms of the pool of migrants you wish to get in the economy. So you can work on that, and okay, you have enough equations to determine the optimal combination. And now I'm going to leave the floor to Tiffanie, who will give some calibrations and illustrate that.
Thanks, Alice.
Good afternoon. So our numerical applications rely on an income function that follows Mincer. So basically what we have is pretty standard. It is a log linear revenue, and it's a combination of the minimum wage and our returns to skill that are here linear. We calibrate these income functions, assuming that they follow a log normal distribution. And we use the Gini coefficient and the GDP per capita that we retrieve from the World Development Indicators. So we are able to obtain closed form expressions for our main quantities. We use the Tversky and Kahneman functional form. This follows on the literature that Tversky and Kahneman has had previously. And this is actually the function that they calibrate. So this is how it looks. What you have to keep in mind is that it's an S-shaped function that pretty much resembles the CRA on the set of positive and is symmetric on the set of negative with a scaling parameter here. In practice, your beta exponent here is equal to your alpha exponent, and that's all you have to keep in mind. From there, you see that we get a pretty straightforward closed form expression for our eviction price. As for the variation in the share of migrants, so we compute the share of migrants ex post compared to the ex ante share of migrants. And so those would be the variation in people willing to migrate after the visa scheme is introduced. We retrieve this variation from the variation in income for those types, theta L and theta I of migrants, from the distribution that we calibrated. For the self-enforcement constraint, we don't have any closed form expression, so we just use an iterative solver for several deportation rates. We set our theta to 0. The intuition behind this is once you apply the self-enforcement constraint to the type of 0 of consumer, then any migrant of type greater than 0 will comply. And so that's how you assure that everyone complies to your scheme. Regarding the benchmark parameters values, so the more difficult to obtain were those marginal cost and price values. So those are from Senegal to Spain. The marginal cost comes from a study by Embo and Tamba. What they have is the cost of crossing from Senegal to Spain on a typical Senegalese dinghy in which you would have 30 people. So we just take the average and approximate our marginal cost, taking the average cost. For the price of migration, so this comes from a survey of Embe that was conducted in Dakar in 2007. and we get something around 1,700 international dollars. The wages come from the International Labour Organization. We have two specifications for Senegal, since the share of the informal sector is pretty large. ILO estimates that you would have like 9 people out of 10 working in the informal sector. And we take the 20th percentile of our distribution, which is something that has been already done in the literature, for example, by Hansen and Groger. Oh, sorry. Yeah, our discount parameter has been pretty well established in the literature, and several work converge to a value around 0.8, in particular, a pretty recent project by Montreal and co-authors who were studying the Spanish labor market. So this is how our eviction prices look like. So the green colors correspond to positive prices, and the orange and red colors correspond to negative prices. Those would be cases in which you would have to subsidize migrants to comply to your migration scheme. The white line is our zero line. The two axes that we represent here are the visa duration on the y-axis and the risk of failure of illegal migration. So the riskier the illegal migration and the longer the visa duration, the higher you are able to set your eviction price. On the opposite end, when the risk of failure is relatively low, let's say 65%, and your temporary visa is relatively short, let's say even 4 years, you have to subsidize migrants if you want them to apply for short-term visas. We also represent here the variations in the share of migrants for those eviction prices. We also did the exercises for more reasonable visa prices. Around the white line, you would see that you have, for pretty low eviction prices, a pretty stable share of migrants who are willing to come to the foreign country. Okay, here is the self-enforcement constraint. So the graph here pretty much resembles the graphs that you saw on the previous slide. Instead of having the risk of failure on the x-axis, you have here deportation rate. Okay? And same as before, when you have something green, that's where you want to go, that's where you have easy enforcement. The white part here corresponds to visas that are not self-enforceable, which means that when we solve the self-enforcement constraint, we cannot find a solution for S being between 0 and 1. So let's say if you have a deportation rate of 60% and visa duration of 4 years, people are going to overstay. And this is the case for more than half of the different combinations that we represent. Even here, if you take something way higher than 80% of deportation rate and you stay around 4 years of duration, you still need to implement a very high retention share that would be between 80% and 100% of migrants' wages. And this is not feasible. We're represented here two isoquants. So in the continuous line, you have 30% income retention, and the dashed line corresponds to 60% income retention. So depending on the home and destination countries, people would send a different share of income back home. And for example, Senegalese people residing illegally in Spain would send about half of their income to their families. So retaining a share that is between 30 and 60% is actually something that is relatively feasible. But you see, this is only for a very small part of the combinations that we represent. If you have two countries with less differentials in wages, this constraint relaxes. So this is the same benchmark as the one as I just represented, and see if you reduce the wage in the foreign country by half, you're able to relax the self-enforcement constraints a bit. Okay? And reducing this by half would be corresponding to migration between Senegal and Morocco, for example.
Oh, great. So I'm going to conclude now very briefly. So to wrap up the results of the paper, so what we have shown, both with a theoretical framework and with policy illustrations, is that, okay, in the theoretical framework, we show that it is possible to design an optimal policy mix, which will be combining the sale of temporary visa at eviction price with an increase in the enforcement of internal and border controls. And this combination will allow governments to both regulate the flows of migrants coming through these schemes and will drive the business of smugglers to go bankrupt. So this is a theoretical possibility. And what is interesting in this theoretical result is that we no longer have the policy trade-off that we used to have when considering other schemes of visa, in particular permanent visa, or when considering extreme views of other economists who might think that we should leave people to cross the borders and that there will no longer be any smuggling market. So here you can both legalize through this visa scheme and regulate the flows. So you can limit the flows of migrants coming through the scheme. There is a big if, however, and this is here where I think the policy illustrations are very interesting. So what we show is that as well, the self-enforceability of those visas is an extremely strong constraint. And we did not have time to show you different scenarios, but we could do the calibration on other routes. And we can theoretically show that this is especially true for routes for which there is a very high wage differential. For example, if you go from Senegal to France, still if you go from Senegal to Spain, but much less if you go from Senegal to Morocco. Okay, and this is especially bad for south to north migration, but that might be food for thought for migration from neighboring countries in south to south migration. So I think we will, I will leave you on that because this is probably enough for today. So we hope that that helps to propose some means to go toward the SDG goal, or at least some thought about whether this is feasible or not to combine different objectives of policies. So to regulate migration flows and as well driving the smuggling business to bankrupt.
Okay. So thanks a lot. We now have time for questions. I had 3 remarks in mind. So given that Frederick has given me the responsibility to chair, I'm exploiting my position. So the first thought is, how would you think about the extension to a setting where you have multiple origins? Because in a sense, you would need to fine-tune the parameters to each origin country. So for instance, there are a lot of migrants coming to Italy via Libya, but they come from different origin countries. So you would probably need different prices to deal with them. And so another question that I had in mind was whether it would be feasible from an ethical or a political perspective to sell the same temporary visa at different prices to different origins. The second question that I had in mind was some sort of general equilibrium effects in which Q can become a function of the total number of people that are trying to cross, and it might be easier to cross when you have few people that try to do so. And in this sense, that would make harder to reduce the legal flow to zero. And then following up on your very last slide, so the one that we are still seeing, are there losers in the destination countries in the sense that these are equivalent workers that are paid a larger wage? So how do enterprises that were hiring undocumented workers respond to this policy change?
So maybe just a clarification about your last question. I don't understand about the loser. Here, the people hired through this scheme will be paid at minimum wage. So, okay,
yeah,
if many come, that is the question.
Undocumented workers was lower because you had a term in front of it that was discounting the wage.
You mean as compared to the ex-ante situation?
Yeah.
The losers, you mean the employers would lose?
Yes, the employers are losers at destination.
Yeah, that will be one. So obviously, because if the employers are happy to pay cheap some workers, they will lose this opportunity. On the other hand, you might think that employers, they will have a large pool of people who can satisfy their job offers. So I'm not sure they will be losers. In fact, it really depends where the constraints come from. And if you think that the employers are bad guys who want to exploit the migrants, it's not clearly the case. And in fact, that is, okay, you might think that a better regulated economy could as well, the fact that you have some revenues, you could try to compensate for losers, whoever they are. So that's the question. First question is about the fact if you have several countries, effectively, as you understand, each price of visa, if you target the maximum eviction price, so if you want to limit the flows at the maximum through the scheme, then you should have a kind of menu of prices. But what we think, rather than that, is that it's not that you can know exactly what is the eviction price and you will exactly put, but you put a price below the eviction price. So it is a means to think about what should be the maximum price if you want to compete and to drive the smugglers out of business. And you might think that rather than the very high eviction price, you might think of putting prices around zero, and you need to check that it will be below the eviction price for several countries, or the main countries, which are the origin countries of the people coming to work in your economy. So this is how we think. And then we can use our calibration. We did that, in fact, where we put eviction price very close to zero, with the idea that they just cover the visa fees or this kind of stuff, to see whether the flows are exploding, but they do not. It's not that everyone wants to come through the scheme. So that's one way to answer. So thanks.
Okay. Joël?
Thank you both for the interesting talk. So actually, I think I would have two questions linked to the implementability, let's say, in reality of such a policy. And I think the last one is related to what you just said. I miss a bit, or I think I misunderstood a bit the constraint from the destination country side. So at some point you show, I think, an uppercase T, which I think is close to this number of accepted or wanted efficient labor by the destination country. So I was just wondering, the way I see the problem would be that you have, on the one hand, a destination country that is willing to accept a very little number of additional migrants, but on the other hand, a huge pool of people that are willing to come. And so I was just wondering, how does this constraint, where does this constraint enter? So, and I think at some point in slide 10, 11, or 12, you showed something as a function of theta and tau, so the duration. And I was wondering whether the optimal policy would not be that you would have a very cheap price, like to make sure that as many as possible want to come legally, but then at the same time, you would need to have a tau that converges towards zero. So you just allow people to stay a very little period, because otherwise you have too many of them. So your T would become too big. So just wondering whether you could say something about this, let's say, this constraint from the destination countryside.
So I think, Joël, you perfectly understood the model, of course. So the point of this policy is that you can set let's say, the flows of migrants. So this T target, okay, depending on how many people, so what is the share of migrants that will reach the destination country? But at the same time, you play with the duration of the visa. And at the end, if you compare that to the status quo situation, where you have people coming illegally and staying forever, or almost all staying for a very long time, as compared to the situation where you have a flow of workers who circulate and only stay for a small duration of their working time. And then we might think about if you might do that in a more dynamic setting. But that will be a way exactly to set, if you don't want to have, you will not have an infinite flow of people coming into the economy. And in fact, they will stay for a short duration of their time, which will really decrease the number of immigrants in the economy as compared to the status quo. So you have a way to play with the model to reach these objectives, which I hope I answered your question.
So yeah, so I guess my question was just whether it's possible that we face a situation where the demand from the countryside, from the destination countryside, is too far away from, so too little compared to the big supply of the potential migrants. But what you mentioned about the dynamic model is actually what I would like. What came to my mind as a suggestion is whether one could extend the model in a way that one would have multiple rounds of these types of visas. So the idea being that you have so many people who want to come. So instead of having everyone staying like in a static framework, everyone staying a specific period of time, you can do 2, 3, 4 rounds where you have 2, 3, 4 groups that then stay a shorter amount of time and still are happy about that. I mean, their equilibrium is still better than not moving or trying the illegal way, actually.
So of course, we would like to do what you say, and we thought about that. So we can work through the intuition of where the results would go doing that. However, this framework, which is the prospect theory framework, does not allow you to do these dynamic models. And this is perhaps one shortcoming. It's very complicated. So if you go back to the expected utility theory, maybe you can do dynamic modeling, but with that, it becomes super impossible to track. So it is complex because you always have a reference point, and if you allow people for like so we worked on that. What we can say, however, is that imagine that, so in the current situation, the existing guest worker visa, they allow people to come twice or 3, or maximum extension 3 times. So for example, in Cyprus, people can come for 2 years to work with people as domestic care, for example, renewable once. And I think it's the same in Israel. So they stay for maximum 4 years. Okay, and so that you can easily embed it in the framework. So you can think that people are going to spend twice, and you can look at how the equilibrium would change if you allow for that to stay longer. And we have, in fact, all the static comparative on the duration of visa. If you think that each time you renew, it is extending your visa duration. So we can give some intuitions of the equilibrium with this type of course, it will increase the number of workers in the economy by, if the visa duration is longer, then if the accumulated visa duration is longer, then it will increase let's say, the number of equivalent permanent workers in the economy.
Okay, thanks. So I would like to thank Alice and Tiffanie once more. So thanks for being online with us today and for getting back to the topic that actually opened this seminar series. April 15, 2020, Martin Ravalian presented the paper that you were referring to. So that was our first session ever. Thanks to all of you for being online with us today, and hopefully see you next week for the presentation by Joachim de Wert and Luc Christensen from the back. Bye.
Thank you very much.